Now we get into the final two sources of financial aid. We begin with this slide, which you see is the FAFSA slide, the free application for federal student aid. Why? Because for the majority of programs that are offered from sources 3 and 4, federal aid and state aid, the FAFSA is the application to apply for the majority of grants and scholarships from those two sources, okay? So if you are a senior that will graduate in the class of 2015, so if you're going to graduate May of 2015, this slide is designed for you because you will be completing the 2015-16 FAFSA, which will be available January 1 of 2015, okay? And the next little bullet there you see is very, very important. www.fafsa.gov is the website that you will go and visit in order to complete, again, what is known as the free application for federal student aid. Why is that very important? You know, a lot of you listening to me right now probably are in possession of a smartphone, okay? And if right now you took out your smartphone and brought up Safari or whatever web browser you have on that phone and Googled FAFSA, I almost guarantee the first site that will come up is FAFSA.com. Well, Jason, what's wrong with FAFSA.com? Well, folks, FAFSA.com will ask you eventually for your credit card, and then it will charge you $80, $90, $100 in order to complete that's right, the free application for federal student aid. Remember, the first F stands for free. And in order to complete the free application for federal student aid, you need to visit, again, FAFSA.gov. This is the government website where you will be able to complete the FAFSA without having to give your credit card number and without having to be charged in order to complete the application to apply and see what you qualify from a federal and state financial aid source perspective, okay? So again, remember, first F stands for free, and make sure you go to FAFSA.gov to complete the free application for federal student aid. Now folks, congratulations. You're not only going to do the FAFSA January, ideally, of your senior year, but you're going to be able and you're going to be required to complete a renewal FAFSA each subsequent January that you are enrolled in college. Because, folks, this is just not a senior year process. This is each and every year you will have to reapply for financial aid. And so you need to go ahead and remember this right now, that not only am I going to do the FAFSA January of my senior year, but I'm going to also complete it each subsequent January that I'm enrolled in college. Now, last thing, priority deadline you see is as soon as possible after January 1st. Why do I make that statement, and why is that in all caps? Well, understand that there are some programs connected with FAFSA from both a federal and a state perspective that are first come, first serve, meaning there are limited amounts of funds for these programs, and those, once the funding is depleted for these programs, that is it for that given academic year. So, we, as in College Access professionals, we encourage all students to complete the FAFSA, at least initially, with estimated information as soon as possible after January 1st, simply to get in line for some of that first come, first serve money, because we don't want you to miss out on it, okay? So let's quickly go over a FAFSA checklist. For a lot of people, this will be the first time that you and your parents, specifically for students, but a lot of time for many parents, this is the first time that you will have to complete a free application for federal student aid. If you talk to others who have gone through this process, you've probably been told all the horror stories or basically been intimidated by this application. I have full faith that every student parent, in this state, if you just carefully read and follow the instructions on the FAFSA, you can do this on your own. That being said, there may be a FAFSA workshop that your school will host, your high school, or even if you're in a community with a local college, they may even host a FAFSA workshop. So, if you're a little skittish about doing this on your own, I definitely encourage you to reach out or to attend one of those FAFSA workshops, for quote unquote expert professional assistance with the FAFSA. But again, let me say this: FAFSA stands for free, so you should not be paying any money to do it on your own, or you should not be paying anyone to actually complete the FAFSA as well. That being said, here's your checklist. In order to complete a FAFSA, students, you need a Social Security number, okay? You have to have a Social Security number because FAFSA, based on the federal law and rules, the student must be either considered a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen, and you must possess a valid Social Security number. So, so unfortunately for some students, you will be unable to complete a free application for federal student aid. You will be unable to apply for federal and state aid because you perhaps at this point in time in your life do not possess a valid Social Security number. So remember, student, you must possess a valid Social Security number in order to complete a free application for federal student aid. Now, being that you are 16, 17, 18, 19 years of age or what have you, the majority of students that I work with until they reach the age of 24 will also need their parents' information in order to complete the free application for federal student aid. So obviously you see the box here about the necessity for the parents' Social Security numbers as well. Now, I will say, if you are a student that you yourself are a U.S. citizen, but your parents, I should say, perhaps are undocumented or do not possess papers, and they do not have a valid Social Security number, you'll still be able to do a FAFSA with them. You will just use all zeros for their Social Security numbers, okay? Again, going back to the first point, student, you have to possess a valid social. Your parents, if they do, that's great. If not, there are some workarounds with that as well. The third bullet you see there talks about driver's license. So, for those of you, whether you have a driver's license, whether you have a permit, or whether you have a state-issued ID, there will be a place on the FAFSA that actually asks for, quote-unquote, the student's driver's license number. Now, here in the state of Tennessee, your state-issued ID, your permit, and or your driver's license, that number is the same, no matter what you're talking about, whether it's the state-issued ID, the permit, or driver's license. So we encourage, when we assist parents and students, specifically students with the FAFSA, is when that's asked, what is your driver's license number, to take out your state-issued ID or permit or driver's license and enter that number. Why? For a lot of public schools now that are required to verify that you are a Tennessee resident, they actually utilize the state-issued ID, permit/driver's license number to verify that you are in fact a resident and qualify for in-state tuition at one of our public institutions here in the state of Tennessee. All right, so if you have it, please enter it. Don't skip the information. But on the other hand, if you for some reason do not have, again, a state-issued ID, a permit, or a driver's license, this actually is an optional question, so it would be okay for you not to answer it if you don't have that number, okay? And that leads us into probably the most important information that you are required to enter on the FAFSA, and that is tax information, okay? As I previously said, the majority of students that we assist with the FAFSA, until they reach the age of 24, the majority of students are dependent upon mom and dad's information, okay? That's why a couple bullets above, we say, you need your parents' Social Security numbers. Well, beyond that, you're also going to have their tax information if they are required to file taxes each year, okay? So if you are a senior graduating in May of 2015, and if you are completing the 2015-16 FAFSA available January 1 of 2015, it will ask for 2014 tax information. Now in January, more than likely your mom and dad are not going to have this ready, nor are they probably, will they want to have it ready that early, all right? So how do you complete the FAFSA? As I have encouraged you already to submit it as soon as possible after January 1 without what the FAFSA is asking for in this case, which is 2014 tax information. Well, you estimate. And I give you some options here. What we mean by estimation is, well, look at your 2013 tax return. Or if you receive that 2014 W-2 information in a timely manner, use it in order to answer or basically plug in information for those questions that's asking about 2014 tax information. Or you can always use the last pay stub. Because here's the point. In January, for those of you who may qualify for some of that first come, first served money from certain programs that are administered by the federal government, and for certain programs that are administered by the state government, or in this case the Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation, here in the state of Tennessee, you're going to be encouraged. You've got to get this FAFSA in initially as soon as possible after January 1st, because this kind of gets your number in line in the event you qualify for some of these first come, first served programs. So guys, it's okay to estimate, because on the FAFSA, it's going to ask, it's going to ask your parents, or whatever your living situation may be at home, it's going to ask, what have you done with your 2014 tax information thus far, all right? Have you already filed? Will you file, or do you not have to file? Right? So it gives you three options to answer that question. So for some of you, right, your moms and dads may not have to file taxes. Unfortunately, they may not have a job, or they may be unable to work, and therefore they're not required to file taxes. Well, for you, you'll simply select you're not going to file that year, or for them, or what have you. But for those of us who have parents who are able to work and are required to file taxes, to estimate, you will simply select will file. And then that way, this will communicate to FAFSA, well, hey, you student A are simply, using estimated tax information to initially get that FAFSA in. And what you will be required to do once your parents, and perhaps you, the student, if you're also required to file taxes because you yourself work, once your taxes are filed, you will return to FAFSA and make corrections, okay? Folks, students specifically, I don't expect you to remember everything I communicate during this presentation, but as I said at the beginning of specifically this slide, more than likely, your high school counselor, your high school will have a FAFSA workshop. So if you feel like, if you will feel better, if there's a quote-unquote an expert, a professional there to kind of assist with FAFSA completion, by all means, I strongly encourage you and your parents to attend one of those FAFSA workshops, ideally there in January of your senior year, to receive assistance with completing the FAFSA, all right? Finally, the other two bullets, the FAFSA in some instances does ask for other information, other specific untaxed income information, such as, perhaps your mom and or dad receive child support, or they may have to pay child support. Depending on that situation, you might encounter this question. You might, and you would be required to enter information for that. And then also, for some students, you and your parents may also be asked about checking information, savings information. Folks, I didn't say that the FAFSA was not an intrusive application. I did not say that at the very beginning. It can be, for the first time around, an intimidating application. I promise you're going to be fine once you get through it the first time around. But just understand, this may ask for information that perhaps you and your parents never have really talked about. So, one thing that as I do presentations, students, parents, mom and dads, understand, folks, this is the time with this FAFSA, this is a time that you might have to have some conversations that you may feel uncomfortable, but understand, as it pertains to you applying for federal and state aid and seeing whether or not you qualify for this, understand, you're going to have to communicate such information onto the FAFSA so that it is able to determine your need for certain programs, okay? So by all means, students, parents, this is a time that you definitely need to kind of open the communication channels and be willing to share this information, to one another, because, this is definitely a very important application that you will need to submit not only during your senior year, but each subsequent year that you are enrolled in college, okay? Now, once you get through the FAFSA, again, at www.fafsa.gov, at the very end, once you submit it, with your personal identification numbers, which is something that a lot of times I kind of wait to really talk about when we're doing a FAFSA workshop at a high school. But understand that you and one parent will both need to sign your FAFSA electronically with using what's called a personal identification number. This is a 4-digit number that you can actually apply for at the end of the FAFSA on the signature page. And this pin is very similar to your ATM pin, right? A lot of us have ATM cards that when we want to go and withdraw money from the ATM at our local bank, we enter a 4-digit number. Well, that's basically what this FAFSA pin is as well, where you will sign up for a pin, and then you will use that 4-digit pin to electronically sign this document. So this is very similar to your ATM pin. This is a 4-digit number that you will be able to create and that you will also need to remember, because you're going to be doing a FAFSA year in and year out so long as you are enrolled in college. Now, that being said, so after you enter your pins, student and one parent, and press submit, you will have a confirmation page. You will see this confirmation page, and this confirmation page will let you know, the student, actually pretty instantaneously, whether or not you qualify for the federal Pell Grant, which is one of the programs that the federal government administers. And like I said at the very, very beginning, when it comes to grants, some of you will qualify for grants like the Pell Grant. Some of you will not. Students, those of you who do qualify for federal Pell Grant, understand, some of you may receive X amount of dollars, like $5,700 of the federal Pell Grant, where others of you may only receive a couple of $100, all right? Because again, every student's situation is different. So understand, not all students will be alike in terms of what they receive specifically from the federal Pell Grant program. Your eligibility for Pell is based on what's called the Expected Family Contribution, or the EFC. This is also communicated on that confirmation page. So as you see, as we enter the 2014-15 academic year, all right, if a student's EFC was between 0 and 5157, that student would qualify for some Pell Award. Now, for an EFC of 5158 and greater, up to $99,999, you would not be Pell eligible. So your confirmation page would not indicate a Pell Award. Now, students, no matter what age you are in terms of what your high school classification is, this EFC, this eligibility for Pell, this is subject to change year to year. All right, so this specifically, what we're communicating today, is for students enrolling in college during the 14-15 academic year. So for those of you enrolling in 2015-16 and beyond, this information will be different, okay? So confirmation page will let you know whether or not you qualify for Pell. It'll communicate your expected family contribution, or at least your estimated expected family contribution, for those of you who are estimating initially. It will also contain detailed information about the colleges that you've entered on the FAFSA. So, there will be a section on the FAFSA that you will enter what colleges you want to receive this information. So, going back to the fall, if you've applied to 3 schools, you probably will want to enter those 3 schools on the FAFSA. If you're one of these students that are really ambitious and applied, to 10 schools, well, the FAFSA actually allows you to enter up to 10 schools on the FAFSA application, okay? So This way, those schools will be able to receive this information and construct a financial aid award letter. All right. Now, that being said, this is one of those where sometimes parents and students and even my colleagues out in the college access world will always ask, well, Jason, when it comes to entering colleges for the purpose of the FAFSA, does it matter what order they are in? Now listen, from a state perspective, meaning from a Tennessee Student Assistance Corporation perspective, we kind of went away from that concept a couple of years ago, all right? In other words, if you're interested in, say, 3 different Tennessee schools, obviously not all of them can be number 1, all right? But does it matter what order now from a TSAC perspective those are in? The answer is no. What matters at the end, ultimately in this process, if you have ended up deciding if you've ended up deciding attending the 3rd Tennessee institution you've listed, you're eventually going to have to let TSAC know so that any aid that you may receive from us is going to go to the right institution, because we're potentially going to lock in that first Tennessee school that you've entered on the FAFSA. So just understand that. Again, guys, this is where I say your school counselor and other college access professionals are here to educate you in this process, and we'll remind you of this. So I don't mean to go into all of this really in depth, but I do want to say that to you so that at some point it may trigger something as you go through this process. All right. So again, that's your confirmation page of the FAFSA and what it indicates to you. Now, 72 hours after the FAFSA is done, or up to 72 hours of the FAFSA, if you have provided an email address on the FAFSA, then FAFSA's also going to send you what's called your student aid report. This to me is very important for you to review, because the student aid report, this is sent after FAFSA itself has been able to review all the information that you have entered on the FAFSA. So, let's say you've made a mistake. Let's say you've entered your Social Security number incorrectly. Hopefully you haven't, but let's say you do. Or let's say that you entered an income or a dollar amount maybe multiple times that you shouldn't have entered multiple times, something like that. FAFSA, will again go through all that information. If it finds an error or a potential error, this student aid report will let you know about it on page 1. And then after page 1 is basically all the information that you've entered on the FAFSA. So, student, mom, dad, you to me need to review this information to make sure everything looks right, that you've entered everything correctly. I have seen where, student, if you work, and obviously your parents work, sometimes I've seen where, the parents said, well, we've made, say, $75,000, right? And then the students ask the same exact question if they work and have to file taxes, and oops, depending on who's completing the FAFSA, whether it's the student or maybe it's mom and dad helping the student, what have you, you thought, well, hold on, I guess it's asking me for that information again, but specifically asking what's the students make, and you entered $75,000 again when that student may have only made, $1,000 for that year. I mean, these are the things that, again, why I encourage families to review that student aid report just to make sure everything looks right, right, and stuff. So again, please make sure you review that student aid report that is sent electronically for those of you who indicate an email. Now, for students that don't have an email address, and specifically who do not report an email, this student aid report will actually be physically mailed to the student. So that could take up to a week or 2 weeks for that student aid report to actually be mailed out. But again, if you didn't indicate in the email, you're still going to receive a student aid report. It's just going to come via regular mail. By all means, open it, look at it, read it. And like I said, going back to the checklist, if there's ever any questions you have about any of this information, ask your school counselor. Ask, if you have a college access professional that you work closely with, ask that individual. Again, don't be afraid to ask questions if you have any, all right? And that's really the student aid report, all right, in terms of the process, and just the importance of reviewing that as you go through it. I guess the last bullet that you see on the slide references a term known as verification. Understand that approximately 33% of all FAFSAs are selected for what's called verification. As I alluded to earlier, if you've estimated your tax information to initially submit this document, you will be required to return at some point and make corrections, all right? When you do that, before or after, your FAFSA may be subject to verification. That doesn't mean you've done something wrong, because remember, verification is a random selection. So if you are selected for verification, please understand the college that you ultimately will attend, or the colleges, if you haven't made that decision, each one of them you may have to actually complete this verification process through before you ultimately make that decision. Understand you have to complete verification, you have to satisfy it before that school releases any financial aid that you may qualify for. So if you are selected for verification, you will find out about it, and you generally will find out about it from the colleges you've been accepted to, and you will just simply have to do what it asks you to do, whether it's complete the verification worksheet it gives you, or perhaps return to FAFSA if you haven't already made corrections using what's called the IRS data retrieval tool. Just understand, if selected, don't panic. That does not indicate you've done something incorrect. This is something that a lot of students, at least 33%, which I know is, in the grand scheme of things, may not sound like a lot, but quite a few that we work with are selected, and you have to go through that process before your financial aid is ultimately released, all right? Quickly, just to highlight some federal programs that are connected to FAFSA, I've already referenced the Pell Grant. This is probably the one program that a lot of you are aware of, the federal Pell Grant program. So again, your award amount will be dependent upon your financial and your family situation. And as I said, some of you will not qualify for Pell because of perhaps your family's your income level, what have you. So understand, some of you will, some of you won't qualify for Pell. For those of you who do qualify, your award amount will vary depending on the need, specifically that expected family contribution that is derived from you completing the FAFSA. FSEOG is another grant that's offered by the federal government, and for specifically students that have an exceptional financial need. Every college disperses this program a little bit differently, but this is an example of a program that has limited funding, all right? So this is why, I encourage you to complete the FAFSA as soon as possible, because if you are one of those students that has a great financial need in terms of paying for college, then you may qualify not only for Pell, but you may qualify from some additional aid from the FSEOG program, okay? And if you're curious, FSEOG stands for Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. Thus the reason we simply say FSEOG. It's a lot simpler. All right, and then last but not least, at least from this slide, is work study. Guys, for a lot of students, you might want to consider working in order to help pay for your college education. And work study, which is connected to federal student aid, is a great way. I mean, I'm an example of someone who participated in a federal work study program when I was a student myself. And this is neither a scholarship, nor is it a grant, nor is it a student loan. Work study is basically where you will be paid a paycheck, just like if you were working at a local grocery or local, fast food or restaurant chain in your community. This allows you to work on a college campus in a specific position that's paid out of federal work study dollars, okay? And this is actually a question on the FAFSA that asks if you want to be considered. So, if you're someone who, wouldn't mind working, and definitely let FAFSA know that you would be interested, and then follow up with that college that you're considering to inquire about what federal work-study positions may be available. Because understand, there are only going to be so many of these positions that are paid directly from federal work-study on a college campus. So, I always encourage students who are considering working, especially on a college campus, to follow up with the institution, sometime during that spring semester of the senior year, to see what opportunities may be out there for you to do this. Now, through federal aid, and this is kind of the last slide dealing with federal aid, not only is federal aid grants, right, free money that's based on need, not only is kind of that work study, that employment aid type program, but this is how you also apply for student loans, okay? Currently, here are your federal student aid options. Here are the current interest rates. Guys, like a lot of this information, depending on when you are consuming this, some of this stuff may change, right? Some of these rates may increase, some of them may decrease. This information is subject to change. Just understand that when it comes to student loans, if you are a student and if you are a family that may need to resort for student loans to help pay for that gap that may exist between what grants and scholarships, free aid that you're receiving, and ultimately the cost of attendance, then obviously this is how you apply, or at least begin the process of applying for student loans, okay? Now, we always like to communicate some student loan wisdom as we go through this. You've heard me use the term a few times, last resort. Again, when I'm in a classroom, when I'm conducting a financial aid workshop, my first thing is, students, parents, I want you to first maximize applying for free aid, which means what? Again, grants and scholarships, okay? Because loans are not free, right? Now, if you're faced at the end where your grants and scholarships don't add up to enough to help you with the cost of a college education, and like I've said a couple times throughout this presentation, there's no one that can guarantee you free aid that will cover all the costs of attendance, all right? It's just not something that us in this college access role can guarantee. So understand, if you have to go down and navigate the student loan road, just remember a couple things. We encourage students to borrow federal first because they're cheaper, folks. They have better interest rates. Once you graduate, they have better repayment terms and they have better repayment plans and options as compared to private student loans, which are also out there for you to consider as well. Again, I'm here to simply educate you your options you have. Ultimately, these are decisions that you and your parents will have to make. But again, what we encourage students to do is borrow federal first if possible, all right? Because understand that some colleges now, here in the state of Tennessee specifically, they're no longer participating in the federal student loan program. So please remember that. So, if you are a student who's going through this process and you are faced with reality that you might have to borrow student loans to help pay for some gaps in terms of your cost of education, please inquire with the college what loans they may have available to you that you can utilize to help with that gap or what have you, because like I said, there are some colleges here in Tennessee that are no longer participating in the federal student loan program. So I don't want you to be surprised, if a college says, oh, I'm sorry, we don't do federal student loans, because again, not all colleges now do federal student loans. Second bullet, students, live like a student while you're in college so you don't have to live like one after you hopefully graduate, right? What do I mean by this? Folks, students, there are loan limits that are put in place where you can only borrow up to so much, at least from a federal student loan perspective each given year, okay? But just because you're able to borrow up to X amount doesn't mean you have to necessarily take out that much money. For instance, if your gap is only $1,000, but you're able to borrow up to $5,000 for that given academic year, what should you do? Well, hopefully you're going to answer, well, I only need to borrow up to $1,000. That would be the correct answer if that's all you need, right? Because remember, that $5,000, if you borrow or $1,000 or anywhere in between, you're going to have to ultimately pay that back plus interest. So only borrow what you need and live like a student while you're in college, so you don't have to live like one after you graduate, okay? Only borrow what you need, again, if you have to go down this road. Do not borrow more for your entire education than your expected starting salary after you graduate. Guys, in terms of employment after you graduate, I know when I went through college, like a lot of you, I think sometimes you have this idea that when you graduate, you're going to easily find a job and you're going to be making six figures, all right? That's the world I lived in, when I was in college and graduated, that I thought, man, once I graduate, I'm going to be making a six-figure income. Well, folks, that's just not how reality works. Now, for some of you that are able to do that, awesome. But, for the majority of us, that first job out of college is sometimes hard to come by. And there's no guarantees that you're going to be in a job that you necessarily were planning on being, because sometimes you have to take that job just to pay the bills. And if I may, a story about myself right quick. I was majored in chemistry, and when I was going through college, I decided that, I kind of like this higher ed thing, so I wanted a job in higher education, whether it was being an admissions rep or a financial aid representative at that college, what have you. But when I graduated, my college specifically had a hiring freeze at the time, so they weren't hiring anyone because they were under a hiring freeze. And so I had to apply for other jobs in the community. So I ended up accepting a position as a bank teller, making minimum wage. My first year working at the bank I worked at, I only made $19,000. That paid my bills, all right? I was very grateful for it, but that was a long way away from my salary of thinking I was going to make $100,000, all right? And some of you are probably laughing at that, because hopefully you don't have that expectation, because I tell you, it's not, there's no guarantees, all right? There's no guarantees. So that's what I mean by do not borrow more for your entire education than your expected starting salary. So, for instance, you may have to do a little research on this. If you're planning on being a teacher, that's great. Understand teachers, you may be making in the 30s a year. You may be making in, $40,000, depending on where you can find a job and stuff like that. Well, if you borrowed $100,000 to attend 4 or 5 years of college education, does that really make sense coming out and having a $30,000 to $40,000 job? Guys, it doesn't. And this is why I say, I'm hopefully educating you about this process for you to make wise decisions along the way. I'm not going to tell you where you need to go to college because ultimately it's your decision. But I just need to make sure you're making wise financial decisions. And finally, along with that about don't borrow more for your entire education, if you're borrowing more than 10 grand a year for college, I would encourage you to consider a less expensive school. Again, I'm using the words I would encourage for you to consider. I'm not telling you what to do, but I would encourage you because, there are cheaper alternatives out there. And like I said, if you do some research on, all right, I want to do this is my anticipated starting salary, make these wise financial decisions so that, going back to bullet point number 2, where you're not having to live like a college student once you graduate and take on that first position. So just some loan wisdom that we like to convey to students, okay? All right, so that covers source number 3 when it comes to federal aid.